Hello and welcome to the Lebanese Politics Podcast. My name is Benjamin Red, and we've got a special episode coming back from a few weeks away for you guys this week. It is me, Nizar, and Timour, the three of us, all three of us on the same podcast. How's it going, guys?
Hey Ben, I'm doing well actually. Yeah, it's the hottest time of the year in Lebanon, just to keep that in perspective always, and without a lot of electricity, but otherwise it's going well.
Yeah, I'm also doing all right. I'm actually in Germany right now, getting vaccinated tomorrow. I had an appointment in Lebanon that was canceled due to internet and power cuts, and so decided that screw it, I'll just do it here. Yeah, we're doing this over the internet. Great to be back with you guys after a few weeks away.
Yeah, and we do have a whole lot to cover. Obviously, we're not going to cover everything that went on while we were gone, because that would end up being something like a 10-hour podcast. But we're going to focus on a few things that happened this week, because essentially this week seemed sort of like a culmination of all of this stuff that's been going on over the past few weeks. We finally got an answer to the government formation question with Saad Hariri. He resigned, and so we're going to be talking quite a bit about that, about everything that went into that, and what are the next steps at this point. But a few other things happened this week as well that I think we should go through, and really everything here is connected. So trying to divide this up into different aspects of the insanity of the crazy crises facing the country is hard to do. But I think one thing that deserves its own special mention is what's going on with the port investigation and the protests about it. Right. So back on July 2nd, the investigative judge in the case, Tarek Bitar, he announced that he's going to ask to seek the lifting of immunity from several top officials, including 3 sitting MPs, as well as the head of general security, the head of state security. And he's going to essentially, this is asking for permission to prosecute some of these officials, if not all of them. And initially, everyone thought, oh, well, this is the same kind of thing that Fadi Sawan, the Bitar's predecessor, had asked to do or had tried to do and got swiftly removed from the case for it. So that it's another gambit to try to sort of, bring back some life to the investigation and show that there is some sort of progress on the one hand. But then that progress hasn't really come to fruition yet. And we saw a lot of people quite angry this week that nothing has happened.
Yeah, I think it's sort of interesting to look at the difference here between Tarek Bitar and Fadi Sawan. Sawan tried to kind of go through, try to kind of move around the immunity issue. In Lebanon, we basically have immunity for many top officials. If you want to prosecute the head of a security agency, you have to get the permission of like the prime minister or the president. If you want to go after an MP, you have to get the permission of parliament. If you want to go after a lawyer, you have to get the bar association's permission. So there's all kinds of hoops to jump through. Tarek Bitar is taking kind of a more, front door approach to this. He's trying to basically go to each one of those, what you would call like a reference, a marja of, for these various officials, and trying to get their various immunities lifted. And so the first person we heard from was the Interior Minister, Mohammed Fahmy, who has to give permission to prosecute Abbas Ibrahim, the Director of General Security, and also really, probably like Lebanon's like top gun in a way, like the guy who's chalked up to be an expert mediator, kind of beyond reproach, untouchable. And after he initially promised to do so, he last week said that he wouldn't provide permission for Tarek Bitar to pursue Abbas Ibrahim. And so this basically led to almost immediate protests at outside Mohammed Fahmy's house. You had the families of victims and also a bunch of protesters. I believe it was several dozen people, maybe at its peak a couple hundred, outside his house in narrow streets trying to break into his house. And you saw some pretty ugly things happen. Families of victims beaten, and then tear gassed in the end and pushed away. And this was kind of the second such event in just a few days before that, protests had also taken place outside the Beirut residence of Parliament Speaker Nabih Berri, because Berri is basically heading a joint committee, sort of a joint committee of two parliamentary bodies that are looking into raising the immunity on three former ministers who are now MPs. Two of those are in Berri's bloc, Ghazi Zaitar and Ali Hassan Khalil, and there's also Nuhad Mashnout, the former interior minister. And they've basically been accused of sort of trying to stall on this issue. It's sort of being seen as an attempt by Parliament to prevent the lifting of immunities by saying all sorts of things like, yeah, we'll do it, but within the law and within the constitution. And in Lebanon, those things are sort of weaponized, usually to protect those in power. And so basically, it seems like we're heading for a lot of escalation as we approach the 1-year anniversary, with one former investigator removed, another investigator sort of trying to get through these immunities, but so far looking rather unsuccessful. And we're just a couple of weeks away from the 1-year anniversary.
Yeah, absolutely. This is definitely something that is going to continue to escalate. I mean, this protest on Tuesday, from the victims' families and others outside Fahmi's house, they had brought these mock coffins and everything, like the rage. Almost a year later, nothing has happened in this case. No one's been held accountable. We don't even really know, there was any sort of results from the investigation. There's a certain rage that is building, at least amongst those most affected by the explosion.
Definitely, and they're basically saying, like, we, don't make us criminals, and they've said this repeatedly. Like, we've tried to be nice, we've tried to come and meet with you and ask nicely, but we are no longer going to do that. And they even said, outside Nabih Berri's house, that Nabih Berri, you are now a target for us. They were even insinuating that he had blood on his hands, and similarly so with the Interior Minister Mohammed Fahmi. They're basically saying that anybody who protects any official that is being sought over this explosion is their enemy, and the enemy of the Lebanese people in a way, because they are holding they're pushing back against what is a sort of unprecedented push for accountability over an unprecedented event. And there's this sense that, if now there is no way to get officials to sit in front of a judge, then it's never going to happen, because the scale of this event is just, so massive.
Yeah, and Fahmi did not seem to be really too fazed by what happened. He doubled down and said, no, I'm not going to, regardless of these protests, regardless of the anger, he's not going to back down on his decision to protect, to shield Abbas Ibrahim from prosecution, which only raises the stakes, of course. I think it's interesting. We saw the ISF, they not only beat some of the protesters there, they also tear gassed them. One of our correspondents at Lorient Today was there at the scene and saw the gas canisters that were used. They appeared to be French, which of course raises many questions, because France is saying something very, very different these days, and talking about holding, potentially sanctioning many top Lebanese officials, and they just announced this week, this idea of an EU sanctions regime that would target top Lebanese officials for doing a number of things: obstructing government formation, obstructing the political process or political transition, obstructing reforms that are desperately needed, and also, interestingly, financial mishandling.
Yeah, so this is something that we've been hearing about for at least a few months. The idea that okay, so if you guys don't, yalla, like, hurry up and form a government and stop, stop this kind of time wasting that you're doing, then there will be sanctions. And it seemed honestly like an empty kind of, an empty threat for quite a long time. There was all this talk of carrots and sticks even a year ago after the blast. It's sort of known that the French were not very keen on imposing, sanctions very quickly. And still, to some extent, they see it as tied to government formation, which which to me at least seems a bit weird. I mean, sanctioning someone for corruption or human rights abuses is one thing, but sort of sanctioning for not forming a government seems a bit high commissionery. It seems a little bit, but basically it's just a sign of like massive frustration. If you remember after the blast, Emmanuel Macron came here a few days later. He then, came back on the 1st of September. It was a centennial of Lebanon, Greater Lebanon. So much symbolism. And, Macron like basically tried to herd cats. He tried to, bring together Lebanese politicians. And if we're being sort of charitable to what's become known as the French initiative, it was basically a recognition that Lebanese politicians should take ownership of the crisis, because the Hassan Diab experience, where you sort of put a guy who's sort of like backed by you but not really, that failed, and it became clear that that basically Lebanese politicians need to come together and decide on things and push them through. That was kind of the French initiative. It's kind of become clear that initiative has sort of failed. I mean, in a way, it's become an empty slogan, just like, fighting corruption or reforms or the rights of this or that sect, that politicians kind of use as as an umbrella term for whatever they want to do. And so, yeah, as this month, we actually heard that the EU has agreed to put in place a sanctions regime for Lebanese officials. The background to that I had heard was basically that the Hungarians were against this. And if you want to take joint EU action, you need all member states to at least not oppose it. And so the Hungarians had met with Gibran Bassil in Lebanon. There was this whole thing of, we don't want a Lebanese minority to be targeted, because apparently the French are quite keen on sanctioning Bassil. And it seems that the Hungarians have now gotten assurances that, it's not just going to target the Christian minority, it's going to be a bit more broad, and they seem to have come on side. And so now there's talk of actually having a regime in place by the end of the month, which is basically like the broad legal framework and sort of like justification. And then once you have that regime ready, then you can go about sort of putting in the names, and that depends on the evidence you have. And I was sort of, told by diplomatic sources that embassies in Lebanon are gathering information now. They're basically trying to create files on Lebanese politicians who are accused of these things, financial mishandling, misappropriation of state funds, and also human rights abuses. And that could include things like the Beirut blast, people found to be directly responsible for causing that. And it's worth noting there that German and French citizens died in that explosion, and so Europe has a bit more of a mandate there to sort of at least it has a bit of skin in the game.
Right, and these sanctions would essentially probably be asset freezes, travel bans, but we don't know how exactly they would be applied, or how broadly, how selectively, etc. Like you say, Timour, like. It depends on whatever evidence they uncover as well, but also we don't know how much transparency we're going to get in their reasoning and stuff. In the American sanctions regime, they oftentimes don't really show their work. It's unclear how much the EU will be showing its work as well in terms of adding new names to this sanction list. So they got to provide the evidence, the supporting evidence, all of that stuff, or is that going to be done through more of an official channel type thing? I don't know.
I get the sense that the EU sanctions are a bit more transparent than the Americans. In the past, EU sanctions have been challenged and overturned, and I think that they're generally quite keen on having evidence that, at least if not released officially, could stand up sort of to a challenge. I'm not sure about the American sanctions. The American sanctions definitely have a reputation of being a little bit more politically motivated. But yeah, no, it's a great point. We actually don't know how it would be applied, and many people are critical of this. Some people would argue that any sanctions on Lebanese officials end up sort of harming the Lebanese state by extension, because you're kind of pushing it into a corner. No one wants to deal with a state where you have top officials sanctioned. So yeah, it's a difficult issue. But the international community are kind of sitting there going, well, at least some players in the international community are sitting there going like, well, we've tried other things and nothing seems to work. And so, it's worth remembering that a lot of these Lebanese zaims and top officials love spending their summers in London and Paris. Their kids live there. They have bank accounts there. And
Properties. Yes.
Yeah. And there's a sense that, well, if Lebanon is being destroyed to this extent, that should not stand. I mean, these people should sort of become pariahs.
It's also going to be interesting to see whether the sanctions have this clear political dimensions that the American sanctions had in terms of not targeting U.S. allies or Western allies in Lebanon, because this also will have a big impact on what will be the repercussions of those sanctions politically, and how much they will be taken seriously by people in Lebanon, or how much positively they would be viewed by people in Lebanon as well. Because if this will look like just an excuse to punish political opponents, then it will not look great, especially that everyone knows when it comes to corruption, when it comes to Lebanese crony, politics, it's not about which regional powers or international powers you're allied with. It's about how much interest to have in the state and in the private sector in Lebanon, and how you can connect these things to each other. So all like, or at least virtually all political forces in Lebanon who are part of the establishment are guilty of those things. You're punishing one or two or three, you're gonna have to justify why it's those people specifically, which takes me to being a bit worried about the criteria that you were talking about, Timur, being obstructing government formation or other quite vague or ambiguous political criteria for sanctions, in my opinion. Because everyone can always blame the other side for the obstruction. We know clearly that people for example, Hariri and Michel Aoun, behind him, Gibran Bassil, have their conditions, and this is why the government formation is not happening. But for a foreign power to say, no, this is the person or this is the side that's responsible for government formation obstruction, that's very controversial politically, and I don't know if we've seen anything similar to it historically, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree. It really is a weird one. And then what if they form a government? You just lift the sanctions. It seems like such a weak approach to just base it on government formation. But we'll have to wait and see. And as it appears now, we're not getting government formation anytime soon. I mean, that sort of takes us to this Hariri resignation fiasco that we kind of saw last week, which is not really a fiasco because it's the kind of thing that like we kind of saw coming, but didn't think he would do. But then when he did it, it's kind of like, oh well, okay, well now that's done. I mean, there was no boom there, it was kind of just it kind of fell flat. And I think let's get into that a little bit now, in sort of what happened last week. Ben, maybe I think you know this better than me.
Well, I think we have to start, but before this past week, right? So Hariri had been telegraphing for a while that I'm thinking about resigning, guys. He was appointed prime minister designate back in October. So now at this point now we've been over 8 months since he was designated to form a government. Nothing's happened. This has been Hariri's longest government formation process, just him personally, although certainly not the longest.
Personal best,
personal best, although this one ended in failure. So I don't know if you can call it that. But prior to this past week, Hariri's surrogates were out there talking about the possibility of him resigning. People took it with varying degrees or varying sizes of grains of salt, I guess. It didn't really seem, at least at first, like it was a credible threat. And then he kept warning through his surrogates, no, really, I'm serious. I'm thinking about resigning. And then finally, everything came to a head this week. We've been having this absolute political theater for the past several months. And the theater finally came crashing down and caught on fire, burned to the ground this week. Because Hariri went up to Baabda to present another list to Michel Aoun. Of course, these are the two men who must decide on any new cabinet. They are the two names, the two signatures that go on the decree. So it's these two guys who have to decide what, have to agree on the composition, who's in the next cabinet, what portfolios they get, the size, all of that stuff. Hariri went up, gave a list of 24 names to Aoun on Wednesday, and he gave Aoun as well kind of a deadline, said, okay, you tell me tomorrow whether this is a yes or no, whether this is a go or not. Of course, the prime minister or the prime minister designate giving a deadline to the Christian president of the country is a little bit sensitive, sectarian wise and power sharing wise, at least perceptionally. So I don't see how Aoun could possibly have followed the first president, the Maronite president, could have followed an ultimatum from the would-be third president, in Lebanon's three presidential system. But regardless, Hariri stuck to it, and he went back the next day on Thursday and had another meeting with Aoun, and apparently, it was an up or down moment, and things went down. And Hariri walked out of that meeting, came out, he spoke to the press, and said, "I resign," which really shocked me. I didn't think that he would pull the trigger this quickly. He isn't exactly known for being brash or taking big, bold steps, but he did in this case. And then immediately we saw the fallout. A lot of areas, especially with a lot of Mustaqbal movement Hariri supporters. We had blocked roads in Kola, UNESCO, Mazra. Immediately, a lot of the partisans took to the streets, although it wasn't, protests in big numbers, but rather road blockings for the most part. And then later that evening, Hariri gave an interview on Al Jadid, to sort of explain his positioning on everything. And this was one of those, long interviews, right? It was something like 3 hours or something.
Yeah. So, to start with, it was an attempt to form his fourth government, and we kind of knew from the beginning that he was putting on this image of Mr. Tough Guy. No more Mr. Nice Hariri. He was a politician who was known for kind of a lighthearted demeanor. He would, hang around after press conferences. He would take quite a lot of questions. He would talk to members of the press. He kind of, had a light attitude. And what we saw when he came around this time was, stern-faced, terse comments after his meetings, very little media, trying to show that he basically had this hard outer shell. But I think what became very clear during this interview is it's very unclear what is within that shell. I mean, we got very little in terms of a vision for the future, in terms of, now I tried this for 9 months, it hasn't worked, there was no clean break. In fact, in this interview, he basically was given an opportunity at one point to sort of basically expose the president in some way. It was a very subtle moment where the interviewer basically asked him but you got some information that would have been very serious, and he's like, yeah, but I don't want to go into it because in the coming period, me and the president are going to have to speak, which is basically him signaling that he's not done. He's still playing the game. He said that he wouldn't name someone to follow him as he had in the past with Mustafa Adib, for example, but he said he could support another government. And basically signaled okay, this battle is over, but the war is not, and I'm staying very much here. But what was clear is that there was no real vision. There was no. It was honestly thoroughly unimaginative. I got the sense after the interview that. It's sort of impossible for these politicians to break in any way from this sort of game that they play, because that's all they know how to do. And so it seemed really outside of, the realm of the possible for Hariri to sort of suggest I don't know, something that would surprise us. And I don't know what that thing would have been. Maybe a resignation from parliament, basically saying like, all right, this hasn't worked. Let's move towards elections so we can at least, have a new parliament that has some form of legitimacy. But we didn't even get that. And it doesn't seem like we are going to get that. And another thing is sort of with this resignation, it seemed to me that in effect, the French initiative, one could argue the French initiative is pretty much dead, because the idea behind that initiative was like, let's bring these politicians together so they can decide on a government and then push through reforms. I mean, it just doesn't seem like that's going to happen at this point. And it seems like the most likely scenario at this point is that we kind of just trundle along until elections in about, what is it, like 10 months. Hariri plays opposition politics, and in a way, everyone can play opposition politics because the president can accuse Hariri of not forming. Nabih Berri can say, well, look at Aoun and Hariri, they're not doing anything. And Hariri can say, well, listen, I tried so hard and I had principles, but Aoun was too, basically held on to the blocking third. And so it's that classic Lebanese scenario where everyone can kind of point the finger at each other. Meanwhile, everything falls apart. I mean, the Lebanese pound was at 23,000 yesterday.
Yeah. I think it's important to go back really quickly, and talk about just sort of that hope. There was never, at least in my perception, there was never a whole lot of true hope that a new cabinet under Hariri would really be able to solve all of the problems and everything. Maybe at least, though, that it would have alleviated certain things, that certain things would become easier, at least in the short term. But there was a great deal of cynicism over whether a government led by Hariri could actually, save Lebanon from the mess that everyone's dealing with right now. However, there was still like a small flame of hope, right? That, okay, at least there's something, like we need something. The country needs something right now. Maybe Hariri will be able to deliver on this. And that tiny little flame of hope on Thursday was totally extinguished. And now it just seems as though everything is in free fall. Like you mentioned, the lira made this massive drop, although it's over the weekend sort of stabilized a little bit, it seems, according to the apps. We'll find out on Monday once the exchangers open up again. Also, the fuel situation, the electricity situation in the country is still horrid. It's eased slightly, at least in terms of fuel. People are waiting less. The lines are shorter at gas stations these days. But everyone knows this is probably just a temporary, reprieve, and probably will be back to, waiting for hours in line to get gas, if there is gas in the future. Also, we've got, coronavirus is starting to rear its head again. We've got the Delta variant here in the country spreading, and we're back to something like 500 new cases per day. Luckily, hospitalizations and deaths are still relatively low, but if you've got a wave of new infections, that means that we will see most likely higher hospitalizations and, unfortunately, perhaps more deaths in the future. So we've got a lot of legitimate crises going on in the country right now, and they're also having problems paying for medicine. The health ministry just announced extreme price rises for quite a few medications just this week. So all of this, the political theater coming to a crashing end this week, it comes when, it couldn't be a worse time for the country, really.
Yeah, it's very clear at this point that like we can't talk about collapsing anymore. This is the collapse, right? Like this is just just the perpetual kind of getting worse every day, but it already being real bad. And like I mean, yeah, it's, you know, you have to sort of ask yourself, and this is a question that many people were asking themselves when Hariri decided to take the job, you know, whether he actually wanted to form a government in the first place. You know, I think that that is a question that we should ask, and you know, there was a lot to be gained by coming forward and, you know, saying that you have these you know, red lines in terms of technocrats, in terms of you know, the size of the cabinet, in terms of the blocking third, and you know, kind of, you know, make a stand, as would be seen, you know, in traditional Lebanese political analysis, like basically, you know, regain the rights of the Sunnis, you know, or show a sort of, you know, be a strong Sunni leader ahead of elections. I mean, there's a lot to be gained you know, from that for Hariri, and I think that. I don't know if you guys agree on this, but I think that Hariri's image is better than it was, you know, at least after October, you know, the October 17th protests, and you know, let's say in the months afterwards. You know, he has at least for some people, you know, sort of made a stand against Michel Aoun, and he did budge on certain things. You know, he started basically saying that he wouldn't budge on an 18-member cabinet. So obviously, his last proposal was a 24-member cabinet. But so I think there's an argument to be made there that, you know, even if he didn't form a cabinet, it was a situation in which at least his name was back in circulation. He made a stand, and now he can, you know, sort of point the finger at Aoun. And many people would see it as rightly so, because the issue of the blocking third really seems to have been, you know, one of the main issues there.
Yeah, I think this is very tricky to because I mean, on one hand, I do agree that not only Hariri might benefit from the way this scenario has played out, but also I think he represents, like, from a class perspective, Hariri represents people who are not really outraged by how the situation is going right now, which is bank owners. We're talking about a period of time when, instead of having a financial recovery plan or any sorts of comeback from the economic crisis, we're having the exact opposite. And instead of having policies, we're having the lack of policy, which in reality, what it's doing, it's cutting, basically doing a huge, huge haircut, constantly increasing haircut on everyone. But most affected are people with small deposits and people who have been, who are the most fragile in the whole economic equation. And if you remember, if we go back to the time of like a year ago, or less than a year ago, there was still the battle over which policies, and the banks and the representatives in parliament were kind of foiling the government's plan, and all of that was happening, and some IMF negotiations, etc. Now that's all not even in public discourse anymore, in a way. Like, it's not talked about so much anymore, and that's the most devastating part, you know. Like, the amount of losses that Lebanon has suffered, and the people, like especially middle class and lower class people in Lebanon, have suffered in the last year, since Hassan Diab's government proposed that plan, which wasn't perfect, but was 100 times or 1,000 times better than what's happening in reality today. The amount of losses, these are real losses. These are two, three, four times as much pain, you know, that we all have to go through, because there was a decision that, you know, it's better to leave things this way and relieve the banks and the central bank of from some of the burden that they should have been taking from this crisis. So, and Hariri represents this class. At the same time, you look at Hariri and you see him, you know, very exhausted, and he seems to be eager to be forming government. It's never it's never a good idea to try to analyze intentions in politics, in my opinion, especially when you're talking about figures of this magnitude in terms of class representation. But at the same time, you look at him and you feel, oh, maybe he is trying, maybe he is genuine in his intentions. And I just say, you know, maybe this is for, maybe he looks tired because of some personal reasons. You know, maybe he has insomnia. We can't, you know, we can't.
Right.
I'm not making joke. I'm saying, like, we can't take things like they look at the surface. Sometimes someone looks very eager to do something, but he knows that even if this fails, actually, Plan B, which is just hanging around and claiming some political credit for trying, is sometimes a good strategy. Because from my perspective, I don't think Hariri ever believed that it's going to be an easiest process. No one is backing Hariri from outside. I don't think any regional power is invested in him 1% at this point. Not the French, not the Saudis. No one believes in Hariri. So who is trying to who is basically the backbone that Hariri is relying on in his negotiation with someone as strong as Hezbollah? Represented by Michel Aoun and Gibran Bassil, but Hezbollah is the one that decides in the end on behalf of Gibran Bassil, and Bassil actually said that in his press conference. He said, Nasrallah, you are the referee, I'll accept what you will accept in the government. And Hezbollah didn't accept, because Hezbollah is not forced to accept, because there's absolutely no balance of political power at this point. There's just a bunch of politicians who are, putting conditions against each other and making some subtle statements against each other. But there's no serious political equation in which something has to happen. No one has interest in that.
Yeah, it seems sort of like a short-term type approach in a lot of the decision-making. Just one quick point, since you mentioned what Hariri has done and what the political class has done. Essentially, when we're recording this, we are at the 2-year mark of the financial crisis. It was, July 2019 when the lira first started to go over 15.20, something like that, to the dollar. And in that time, have the losses been allocated or anything like that in any sort of fair or systematic way? No, as you say, all of the decisions have been put off, which means that, the public bears the brunt. And anyone who has a bank account gets this huge haircut. They are the ones who are, in effect, absorbing the losses from this. As far as Hariri goes, I think it's important to note that, he kind of, in a certain analysis, that I've heard from certain circles, he kind of had to take this stand against Gibran Bassil, which, does work in his favor as far as just his popularity is concerned, because a lot of people they look at Hariri, they look at the deal that was made for him to come to power for his second government in 2016 with Michel Aoun becoming president and then him becoming prime minister. And then the next cabinet, again, a deal between Aoun and Bassil on one hand and Hariri on the other hand after the 2018 elections. And a lot of people have the perception that essentially Bassil got one over on Hariri both times, and essentially has been using Hariri as a useful idiot in a certain sense. And if this is the perception, then Hariri needs to stand up and say, hey, no, you're not going to do that to me a third time, especially not with the stakes this high. And so I think the part of the reason that his standing increases because of this is because he is seen to be standing up to Gibran Bassil.
Right, and I think, another point on this, and Nizar, it goes to your point of sort of the interests that Hariri represents. From what we know of this cabinet, it almost goes without saying. This was not going to be a break from the past. When you talk about allocating the losses in a just way, when you talk about, the kinds of reforms that really matter in this system, like deep kind of reforms that fight structural corruption and really amend the systemic reasons why we have this sort of constant blockage in Lebanese public life. Hariri, it doesn't seem like the person who's going to do that. And if you look at his cabinet, the latest proposal that we had, which appears to be the one that was, that he took up to the presidential palace with him on the day that he resigned. The person who was supposed to head the finance ministry was the person who was the architect of the financial engineering, in 2016-17. The person who was going to head the public works ministry is the director of policy at the Council for Development and Reconstruction, the CDR, which is known by everyone to be a thoroughly corrupt body. It's just a place where tens of millions of dollars of state funds have been lost to corruption. And so, when you look at these names, and there was also someone who was a top aide to Rafiq Hariri, his father. This was not a cabinet of independent specialists, or experts who were going to come and sort of turn the tables. And in fact, it very much looked like a cabinet, the kind of cabinet that we're used to, the kind of people who can hold the course, the kind of people who are known to be loyal and known to be sort of, in a way, pawns of the people in power. And so many people, when Hariri stepped down, basically said, great, because the kind of damage a cabinet like that could have done in terms of the decisions it would have taken, in terms of preserving those interests, could have been catastrophic. In fact, even worse for the people than what we're seeing today. Obviously, it's hard to compare different kinds of horrible, but that certainly is one of the opinions that's out there. It's actually better that Hariri didn't form a cabinet.
But then with that, Timour, we're left with this question. So what now? There seems to me to be no clear path forward at this point.
It's also very scary that one very possible, very likely scenario is having Hassan Diab's caretaking government kind of extending its or going all the way till the elections for many reasons. First one is we have a terrible electoral law, and the next elections won't be representative in a better way than the previous ones if we change nothing in the law. And without new government, I can definitely say like there won't be any changes to the electoral law without an active government. It would be highly unlikely, at least. But also second is that from now till the elections, the crisis is getting maybe not exponentially but increasingly worse, and the impact much worse on people today. By the day, I mean, every single day the situation is getting much worse than it used to be getting by the day, a year ago or whatever, because of how much impact a small reduction in subsidies has on how many people. You see, we're at the stage where the crisis is, as you said, Timour, we're down in the collapse, and we don't know if there is a bottom, but we're going down quite quickly. So if this trend continues or this situation continues, then we're getting to the election at a point where, first of all, it's very easy to postpone it with any kind of fabricated security event that would, exploit people's suffering and pain and protests or whatever is happening to say, oh, it's not safe, it's not okay to have elections. If they need to postpone them, if the people in power see the need for that or an interest in that. But also, when people are much poorer, then clientelism and pre-election vote buying, basically, this kind of bribery that happens on a huge scale in Lebanon will be also much more powerful than in a scenario where the country seems to be getting back on its feet and heading towards financial recovery or economic recovery. So it will be a bleak moment. It won't be a moment where you can have, a healthy democratic process. And also, it will be another year of doing absolutely nothing, with everyone who's not supposed to be paying the price of this crisis actually paying the price and suffering. So yeah.
Absolutely. And not only that, the names that we've seen, sort of thrown out there and suggested so far for the potential next prime minister it's sort of more of the same. Mustafa Adib, Najib Ati, Mohammed Safadi. Heard that name the other day. None of these are
Back to the future.
Yeah. These are, old ideas that don't really seem, to bring a whole lot of hope or possibility for any sort of true resolution.
I mean, yeah, I agree.
And to add to that as well, with certain of these names, Mikati is definitely going along with Hariri on these things. He's, not going to be independent of that. And any of these other names, I don't see how this goes forward. And so I think, like you, Nizar, to me, it seems like the most likely thing is that we continue bumbling on with Hassan Diab. Maybe they do the binding parliamentary consultations. Maybe they select somebody as a premier designate. But then we have another question of, well, how long is that going to take for any government to be formed? And so it is very, very possible that Hassan Diab's cabinet just stays, perhaps is reactivated to some degree. I mean, if they do elections, there will have to be, I believe, some sort of reactivation for that. But yeah, it seems as though Lebanon is literally stuck with, at least for now, the country is definitely stuck, with the caretaker cabinet it has.
And I think if you look at the possible scenarios, sort of to wrap up here, I mean, that my fear, and I think the fear of many, is that, now it can be argued that while these people remain firmly in power, there's a serious question about their legitimacy. if we go to elections and they are able to create a situation where they do very well in those elections, then I think they perhaps have the right to claim legitimacy once again, and then deal with the international community again in a sort of normal way. I mean, I wonder I wonder where we are in a year, and sort of it doesn't seem like the outcomes generally are positive. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a transition of power. What many people seem to be, holding out as their hope is a political process, a process of political change that really takes very long. Nizar, I know that you've been involved in that, and sort of grassroots kind of activism and grassroots organizing, and that kind of thing just takes time. There is no sort of immediate solutions on the horizon. These are sticky leaders who are stuck to their seats. And it kind of goes without saying, but they're showing no sign of budging, and it's sort of very hard to sort of get them unstuck. And that process, again, I mean, it seems like it's going to take a long time, and it's the kind of time that the country doesn't really have.
And at the same time, though, I think it's very, very difficult to look out and project what's going to happen in a year, because right now, I think that there's quite a bit of confusion, even amongst the political class, like, oh, shit, what do we do now? And this is only going to escalate, especially over the next month, as we have more fuel shortages, electricity shortages, and we have, the anniversary of the Beirut Port explosion coming up. Things are only going to build at this point. And a year from now, I think it's just very hard to project out to that, because at least within the next few months, something has to give somewhere.
As Hariri said, Allah ya'in al-balad, which basically means God help the country, or Yeah, so I don't know how we wrap this up, guys, after that conversation. Maybe what's most appropriate is just us all crying. I don't know, maybe that that's
Yeah, seriously.
I mean, it's always important to know that to remember that history is not stopping anytime soon. It's just like really bad right now, but like it's a war after another that you lose. It doesn't mean that the whole existential war or for survival and for prosperity and stuff is lost. It's just that all the circumstances seems to be against any progress right now at this second. We might have a big US-Iran deal that brings a new government that brings in some money without any radical solutions, but buys us some time. We might see a lot of things that change the equation in a way or another. It's good to always be thinking of politics as a circumstantial thing and a game of interests. It's not like fate. It's not, we're not doomed. We're not destined to fail or to crash as a country.
Right. The issue is there's just added to everything else that everybody has to deal with in the country right now. There's just this added uncertainty, which is an added burden at possibly the worst possible time. Okay, and on that note, I think that does it for us for this week. It was good talking with you guys, even if the subject matter was super grim.
Yeah, agreed.
It's good to be back.
Very good to be back.
All right, and no promises on when we will be back next, but we're back in the saddle now, so hopefully quite soon we'll be back with another podcast. Until then, I'm Benjamin Red.
I'm Nizar Hassan.
I'm Timour Azhari.
And this has been the Lebanese Politics Podcast.
Lebanese Politics Podcast is brought to you by myself, Nizar Hassan, Benjamin Red, produced behind the scenes by Susan Wilson, and the music is by Omar El Fil.